The heart of mankind. Twilight spent as much time as she could practicing with her new sword. Mashes and the others had said it was old, but Twilight did not care for age. It was lighter than any sword she had encountered before, well balanced for its intended purpose, and whoever had forged it had etched a beautiful flowing pattern into the guard, the center adorned by a small twin-headed eagle. She could have done without the golden skull in the pommel, but that was something she had come to expect of humanity, with death surrounding them in a myriad of forms. Embracing it seemed the only way for them to stay sane. Princess Celestia had not commented on that when Twilight brought the issue to her. In fact, as they drew closer to Terra, it was a rare sight to see Celestia at all. She remained in her room while Twilight wandered about to explore, and could not be found in any of the public areas that the crew frequented. When Twilight approached her room, Celestia did little to make her presence known, not even responding when Twilight called to her. The sun is resting below the horizon, the psyker that traveled with Mashes, Angelique, had said when Twilight caught her curled up outside Celestia's room. But soon it shall rise, and cast a new dawn over a darkened world. Angelique had soon been ushered away by her caretaker, but the message would rest on Twilight's mind. She's probably just resting for when we reach Terra, Twilight reasoned. She needs time to prepare whatever she has in mind to save the humans, right? Twilight's answer came soon enough. She could feel the cruiser slowing, warp drive quieting as sublight engines were reactivated. No sooner had Twilight detected the change that she heard a knock at her door. "Hello. It's me, Twilight," Celestia replied. Twilight hopped off her bed and hurried to the door, taking only the briefest of moments to compose herself before opening the door and allowing Celestia to enter. Celestia was once more dressed in a grey cloak, the hood pulled up to hide her face, yet Twilight could still see her smile beneath the shadows. "I suppose you noticed that we are slowing down." "Yes," Twilight nodded. "We're nearing Terra." "Correct." Celestia drew back her hood before continuing. "I stopped by to make sure you are ready for all that you may see there." "I think you've more than prepared me," Twilight replied, giving a small smile. The smile faded as Celestia failed to return it. "In my experience, there is little that can prepare one from an alien realm. Terra has fallen far from the splendor I have told you of, and may prove strange even to me. What you see may shock and distress you, but remember why we are here. To make sure humanity doesn't die out," Twilight said, her confidence returning as Celestia gave a short nod. "Don't worry, Princess. You asked me to help, and I won't stop until I have done all I can to help these people." "That is all I wanted to hear, Twilight," Celestia replied, placing a hand on Twilight's shoulder. "You continue to amaze me with how far you have grown from when we first met, and I am proud to call you my student." Twilight beamed, her smile not wavering even as Celestia removed her hand and turned towards the door. "Come, the Inquisitors will be waiting for us." "Oh." Twilight took a moment to recover her sword from where she had placed it the previous night before hurrying to fall in place next to Celestia. "You don't like Inquisitor Marcos, do you? What makes you say that?" Celestia asked. Twilight had known Celestia long enough to detect the subtle amusement drifting through her words. "Well, I kind of saw you two arguing when I got my sword," Twilight said. "And he glares at me whenever we're near each other, and since he's never actually taken time to talk to me I figured that he was angry at me for something you did." Twilight noticed Celestia's slight shift in gaze before backtracking. That's what I guessed, anyway. You are not far from the truth, Twilight." Celestia looked ahead before continuing. "Inquisitor Marcos is most suspicious about who I am and whether or not I am truly the Emperor's herald." "Why? You haven't done anything wrong, have you?" "I may have made a few less than savory observations about his faith, nothing more." There was a pause before Celestia spoke again. "The Inquisition rose out of necessity, not choice. I had been entombed within the Golden Throne for many years by the time it reached its current state, corrupt and paranoid." "Mashes isn't paranoid," Twilight started. "I mean, he's asked me a lot of questions, but he's never accused me of anything." "You even said he wasn't paranoid." "Mashes is young, Twilight, that is a different set of problems entirely." Twilight looked away for a moment, a frown forming on her face. There's nothing wrong with being young, she thought. There is no need to worry, but remain alert. The Inquisition will attack anything that it perceives as a threat towards the Imperium or itself, and it will use any information it can to justify its attack. Mashes wouldn't do that, Twilight said quickly. Not everyone has to be paranoid if they want to protect their home. Celestia was silent for a moment, her focus directed ahead, before a small smile formed on her lips. With you at my side, there might yet be hope for humanity, she whispered as they stepped into the main hangar. Mashes and his retinue were standing before the cutter, Angelique staring off into space while Mashes reviewed Alexis and Nikolai. The two soldiers were now dressed in black and silver armor, their shoulders marked with the stylized eye of the Inquisition, while Mashes wore a smaller, slimmer version of the armor Celestia wore. He turned slightly to acknowledge Twilight and Celestia's presence, but it was only fleeting before he turned back to the soldiers. And keep a close eye on Lord Marcos, he finished. I respect the Lord Inquisitor, but he has been making numerous private communiques since we entered the Sol system. It's possible that the Ordo Hereticus may try to usurp control of the situation from us, and that might lead to further divisions that the Imperium does not need right now. Yes, sir. Nikolai replied. Alexis, however, had other ideas. Can we just cut our ties with the Inquisitor, he offered. If he's really causing so much tension, why not just conduct the Herald to Terra ourselves and leave him behind? Marcos has become too involved in the mission for that, Mashes countered. Also, that might be considered treasonous to certain ears. Refrain from saying anything negative about the Lord Inquisitor for the time being. Yes, sir. Alexis nodded. Now, Mashes turned his attention to Twilight and Celestia. I see you're ready for the trip, he said, turning his full attention towards Celestia. My superiors have arranged for you to make your case before the High Lords. How long will I have? Celestia asked. 30 minutes. Mashes shrugged. I know it must not seem like much, but if it reveals the location of the Emperor then it may be more than enough time. It is more than sufficient. Glad to hear, Mashes turned his attention to Twilight. Terra, however, will have to remain with my followers while you speak to the High Lords. I made a request from the armory, and this carapace armor should be about your size. Mashes stepped aside, revealing a boxy set of armor similar to what Alexis and Nikolai were wearing until further notice. You are officially an agent of His Holy Ordos under my command. Hopefully this will not draw much attention, but there are always those who might be a bit more intrusive. Twilight swallowed, but gave a short nod before stepping over towards the armor, placing her sword on the deck where she could recover it later. Nikolai and Alexis moved to assist her while Mashes turned once more to Celestia. The armor was a bit heavier than Twilight had thought it would be, her arms sagging slightly as she lifted up the breastplate. You'll get used to it. Alexis said, taking the armor from Twilight before slipping it over her head, tightening the straps once her arms were free. Twilight gave a nod of thanks before moving on to other segments of the armor, securing the plates around her waist and thighs while the Valhallans secured her shoulder plates. Once they were finished, the two stepped back while Twilight took a moment to try and move around. The armor at least did not stop her from moving around, though it did press down on her shoulders more than she would have liked. She made a small circle of the space around her, just a slow walk to try and get used to the armor's weight. That task complete, she reached down and picked up her sword from where it rested, twisting it around in her hand for a moment before attaching it to a clip at her side. It would take some getting used to, but at least Twilight felt safe. Are you finished now? Twilight looked up as Lord Marcos strode into the room. He was dressed similarly to Mashes, though his armor was coated in red and black instead of Mashes' green and silver. Twilight took several steps back, stopping once she was sure she was at Celestia's side once more. We do not wish to keep the Lords of Terra waiting, now do we? Of course. Mashes said, his voice colder than Twilight was used to. Is there anything else you wish to say, Lord Marcos? At the moment, no, Marcos replied. Though rest assured, I have taken some extra precautions to make sure that our meeting with the High Lords goes smoothly. Twilight noticed Mashes tense slightly. She refrained from saying anything, lest it draw Inquisitor Marcos' anger. Celestia, though, remained calm as ever, even as the Inquisitor cast his gaze towards her. Everything has been secured, Mashes said, breaking a bit of the tension before he gestured towards the ship. Miss Celeste, Lord Marcos, if you would please. Of course, Mashes, Celestia replied, giving Twilight a gentle nudge towards the cutter. Twilight kept her head down, not even looking up from her feet as Alexis and Nikolai formed up alongside them. The mare walks on paths of broken glass, Angelique mumbled. But she need not worry, for the light guides her path. Twilight paused long enough to give the psyker a glance, but Angelique was soon ushered away by Sister Bianca before she could say more. Twilight shook her head and continued on, finding a chair in the main hall of the cutter. Celestia remained standing, her eyes closed as if meditating, while Alexis and Nikolai found their own space before the ship lifted off from the hangar. Terra, Alexis whispered. Never thought we'd live long enough to see the cradle of mankind. Nikolai replied with a short grunt before closing his eyes and whispering a prayer beneath his breath. It took Alexis a moment before joining his brother, the two soldiers clutching their weapons close to their chests as they gave their praises. Twilight watched them in silence, trying and failing to discern what the two were saying. As the soldiers prayed, Twilight cast a glance over at Celestia. She still kept her eyes closed, but now it seemed as though a light had enveloped her, wrapping around her body like a cloak. Whether it was a side effect of her powers or from the prayers of the others, Twilight was unsure. This world seemed to bring new changes to it every day, and little time for her to record anything for better understanding. Perhaps, once Celestia revealed herself as the Empress, she would have time to do so. The ship lurched, Twilight grabbing the side of her chair to keep from being flung to the floor. Celestia shifted only slightly, while Alexis and Nikolai also steadied themselves against the wall. Looks like we just broke it, Mo, Alexis said. Won't be too long before we're on the ground. I don't think I will ever get used to that, Twilight mumbled. Hey, you didn't throw up at least. Alexis said, grinning. I remember we were doing an operation near the Halo Stars, and this one guy, Pietro I think his name was, vomited the whole way down to the planet. The commissar almost shot him dead as a hazard to the mission before we landed. Twilight gave a small whimper as Alexis chuckled. Alexis, Nikolai started. You're not helping. What? Someone needs to lighten the mood. Alexis countered. Nikolai merely gave Alexis a short glare, the other Valhallan shrugging as the rattling stopped. Minutes ticked by, Twilight's eyes once more darting between the others in the room, before Mashes stepped out from the next hall. We just got clearance to land at the Imperial Palace, he said. Once we're on the ground, I want everyone to stick close to me. I have no idea what Lord Marcos has planned, and while I doubt it is a malicious scheme, it might tip the balance too far out of our control. Worry not, Mashes, Celestia said, finally open her eyes. Soon, you will no longer have to fear the machinations of Lord Marcos. We shall see. Mashes turned to Twilight. How are you holding up, Terra? I'm fine. Twilight gave a short nod. Good. As you're acting under my command, I'd like you to keep an eye on Marcos as well. His face grew serious. And whatever you do, do not use your psychic abilities, whatever they may be. Marcos is a trained member of the Ordo Hereticus, and he would know well the manipulations of the Psyker and the Witch. I'd never use my powers to manipulate anyone, Twilight mumbled. Marcos doesn't know that. Mashes turned away from Twilight. Now look alive, we should be landing soon. Alexis and Nikolai nodded, readying their weapons while Mashes disappeared, most likely to speak with Angelique and Sister Bianca. Once Mashes was gone, Twilight rose to her feet, taking a moment to readjust to her new armor's weight before crossing towards Celestia. Celestia was still a stable point. That, at least, Twilight could take comfort in. Angelique and Sister Bianca returned just as the ship bounced slightly. We must have landed, Twilight though, trying her best to clear her mind. Angelique gave Twilight a glance, her head cocked to one side as she eyed Twilight up and down. Breathe deep, the Psyker said. For the mare will not know of the air. Thank you. Twilight started. Though Angelique may be a bit odd in her wording, Bianca said. She is not wrong. From what I have heard, many a visitor to Terra has had difficulty breathing in the first few hours of arrival. I will stay close to you if you wish. I think I'll manage, Twilight replied. I mean, best get it out of the way quickly, right? Bianca did not return Twilight's smile, but said nothing to correct her. Soon Mashes and Marcos returned, the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor remaining behind the younger man. We have arrived, he said. A shuttle will conduct us to the High Lords. After that, it's all up to our herald to prove her case. Celestia gave a short nod before Mashes continued. This has been a most unusual mission. However, we have made it this far, and with the will of the Emperor to guide us we shall see it through. Until then, you know what has been asked of you. Mashes closed his eyes and hung his head. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Valhallans, Sister Bianca, Marcos, even Angelique chorused. There was a short pause before Marcos spoke. Herald, he asked. Would you care to speak before we stand before the High Lords? All that needs to be said at this time is not for me to say, Celestia replied. Rather, I have taken this time to meditate and prepare myself. Surely you would have no objection to this. Of course. Twilight noticed Marcos furrow his brow, but she refrained from speaking. Mashes broke the tension by stepping away from the Lord Inquisitor. Celeste, if you would please follow me, he said. Celestia nodded and fell in place behind Mashes, Twilight and Mashes' group hurrying to catch up. Marcos brought up the rear, his gaze still placed firmly on Celestia. I have no idea what Lord Marcos has planned, and while I doubt it is a malicious scheme, it might tip the balance too far out of our control. Mashes' words caused Twilight to shiver. If these two could not work together, what would that say for those that Celestia hoped to help? There was a hiss of air as the ship opened to the outside, and Twilight choked as the door slid away and the air of Terra swept in. Having a dragon blowing smoke in her face was nothing compared to the smog of the planet, Twilight coughing for close to a minute as her lungs burned. Outside, the sky was blanketed by a yellow cloud of smoke. The only difference in the cloud was a brightened point Twilight guessed was where the sun was. Beneath that, a dark angular shape rose upward, smaller lights flickering along it as it disappeared into the smog. How can anyone live like this? As I said, much has changed since the heresy. Celestia whispered. I will explain later. For now, we have more pressing matters. Twilight raised an eyebrow before looking past Celestia and their escort. Assembled before the ramp were 5 soldiers dressed in black armor with red robes around their waists and arms. Their faces were hidden behind black and white helmets, with only glowing red slits to indicate where their eyes would be. One of them had broken off to speak with the 2 inquisitors, Mashes doing his best to keep his glowering to a minimum. Celestia stepped forward, Twilight following behind her. Is something the matter, my lords? She asked. Ah, Herald, Marcos stepped to one side to introduce the soldier. Sister Naomi of the Order of Our Martyred Lady. She and her squad will be providing escort for us to the High Lords. Is that so? Celestia asked, turning her attention to the other woman. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, sister. Indeed. Naomi replied, her voice accented due to the mechanics of her helmet. Lord Marcos has told me of your mission. We shall see if your message really is all you say, and if you prove yourself to be a threat to my lord or the Imperium. Though Naomi said nothing more, her hands slid towards her side, where a chainsword and what appeared to be a combi weapon hung. Celestia seemed unimpressed, but Twilight could feel her nervousness welling up inside her once more. I am sure it will not come to that. Celestia replied, giving Naomi a smile before continuing. You need not worry, sister, the Emperor's trust was not unfounded when he asked me to carry his message. Naomi only gave a short grunt, stepping back to allow Lord Marcos to speak. As the Inquisitor spoke, Twilight noted that Sister Naomi and one of her fellows had shifted their gaze towards herself. Twilight said nothing, though even as she tried to turn her focus to the Inquisitors she could feel her eyes drifting back towards the sisters. Celestia and Mashes had told her of some humans' distrust for psychers. Perhaps these women were merely eyeing her with this distrust. If so, would they be so ready to listen to Celestia once she revealed herself? What exactly have you changed, Marcos? Mashes asked. You think that I am obstructing the will of the Emperor? Marcos replied, all but scoffing. Dear Mashes, I am not some heretic to be contrary to such matters. The Sororitas will provide more protection than your henchmen could, and once we speak to the High Lords I was under the impression that the High Lords would speak only to Celeste. Matters have changed, Inquisitor. If you seek to challenge me, you may speak with the rest of the Ordos to see where my orders come from. Celestia watched as Mash's jaw tightened. As good of a man as he might have been, he seemed too easily angered when situations began to spiral out of his control. But then, Lord Marcos appeared to be going out of his way to pull this matter out of Mash's hands. Such infighting would have to be dealt with. My lords, please, she said, catching the attention of both men. I believe we best set aside our bickering for now and move on, the High Lords will be expecting us, after all. Of course. Lord Marcos replied. Come, the shuttle that will take us to the High Lords is waiting. With that Marcos strode off, the Sororitas squad forming up around Mash's entourage before the remaining people started off after the man. Celestia kept her eyes forward, shifting them only to trace the dark outline that was the wall of the Imperial Palace. Even millennia after her departure, it had barely changed. The shuttle provided was nothing more than a modified Valkyrie transport, its weapons and most of its armor stripped away to provide more room for passengers. Celestia paused briefly. Valkyries were fine transports, but even with her disguise her armor would perhaps be a bit much for those traveling with her. Let's hope it is not too noticeable of a disturbance. The Inquisitors and Mash's retinue stepped aboard first, with Celestia and Twilight following as the Sisters of Battle brought up the rear. Celestia paused again as the shuttle creaked slightly as she stepped aboard, but put it out of her mind as the others prepared for the journey. Celeste, Mash's said, catching Celestia's attention. There is no need for you to stand, the trip to the High Lords may take some time, and it might not be in our best interests if you were to tire yourself out. I will be fine, Celestia said, giving Mash's a smile. The Emperor has carried me this far, I do not feel that he shall allow me to falter now. Mash's merely nodded, stepping back so he could secure his own seat. The whine of engines rose as the transport took off, circling over the landing pad once before flying towards the palace. Soon. Celestia thought, closing her eyes and focusing her energy. She had little time for further contemplation before one of the sisters spoke. Harold, the woman asked. May I ask you a question? You may, Celestia said, turning slightly to face the sisters. Though I feel that it might be easier if I could speak to you face to face. There was another pause as the sister looked to her superior. Naomi gave a short nod in response, and the sister proceeded to remove her helmet to reveal a young woman not much older than Twilight, her white hair cut in a short bob and a ragged scar running from her forehead to her cheek. What is your name, sister? Celestia asked. Ruth, the younger woman replied. I have served the order faithfully my entire life. I have no doubt that you have, Celestia said. Now, there was something you wished to ask me. Yes. Ruth's hand clenched slightly, and Celestia could tell the sister was fighting the urge to chew on her lip. You serve the Emperor, you must have spoken to him in person. I have. At this, Ruth's nervousness seemed to evaporate. If I may ask, what was it like to stand in his presence? Long have I dreamed about the chance of seeing him, not just in death or in a vision but actually standing before him and witnessing his glory. What words did he say to you? Do you bear a mark of his presence? What visions did he dash? Ruth. Naomi snapped, drawing the sister's attention away from Celestia. There is no need to drown the woman in questions. Sorry, sister, Ruth mumbled. I just wanted to know what it was like to stand before the Emperor. I'm sure that is something we are all wondering, a second sister said. But Sister Naomi has a point, if you ask too many questions now you will never be able to receive an answer. I understand completely, Celestia said, raising a hand to calm the sisters. And truly, I do not mind, I have dealt with far more trying matters than one who is curious. Ruth gave a short nod, her eyes still averted as Celestia continued. But I assure you, standing before the Emperor is as glorious and awe-inspiring as you have been told. When he returns, I assure you that you will experience such glory for yourself. All the sisters of battle, not just Ruth, raised their heads at this. Ruth's eyes widened, her nervousness vanishing once more as she looked on at Celestia. After a pause, Ruth closed her eyes and smiled. "Thank you, Harold," she whispered. "That is all any of us could ask for." There was a pause before Ruth turned her attention towards Twilight. "And you? Have you seen the Emperor?" Yes. I guess I have." Twilight shifted in her seat for a moment. He seemed nice." At this, another one of the sisters let out a short giggle. "Do you have something to say, Judith?" Naomi asked. "No, sister," Judith said, working to suppress her giggles. I was right. I told you all the Emperor was nice, but you all said no, he must be firm and commanding, he has no time for such small concerns." "Well, guess I know more about the Emperor than all four of you. If this is about that weird idea you have about bribing your way to become a canoness," Ruth started, to which Judith scoffed. "I would never do such a thing," she cried. "Though, since I asked them nicely the first time, maybe I can use this to become a canoness." "Sister Naomi." "No, Judith." Naomi turned her head away. "If you want to become a canoness, you will have to prove yourself just like everyone else." Judith was about to speak again when Naomi continued. "And claiming divine knowledge is not a free pass. But if it's from the Emperor, they will have to listen." Judith looked to Celestia. "Is that right, Harold? Can the Emperor make me a canoness?" "I cannot make any promises," Celestia said, giving a chuckle of her own. "But speak with him, and I am sure his favor will not be far off." Though she still wore a helmet, it was not hard to tell that Sister Judith was beaming. None of the other sisters seemed ready or willing to speak, and Celestia could understand, it was still quite a lot to take in, the possibility that one's God would be standing before them soon. Even if their God is not who they think, Celestia thought, closing her eyes, their faith will be more than enough to blossom into something greater. The flight to the great chamber of the Senatorum Imperialis had taken close to an hour, and all throughout this Mashes found himself growing more and more tense. His left hand clenched and unclenched, and a small bead of sweat formed across his brow. His focus was placed primarily on Marcos, the Lord Inquisitor focused on the looming structures ahead. The Sororitas were a setback, sure enough. He knew that Lord Marcos would try something to take control of the search of the Emperor, and a squadron of battle sisters would certainly send a clear message of who was more capable between him and Mashes troopers. Throughout the flight Marcos had listened closely to Celeste's conversation, even if he was not making it noticeable, picking up potential points of attack against her claim to the title of Herald, perhaps. Now what rested on Mashes' mind was what the Lord Inquisitor would try next. "We have arrived, my lords," the shuttle pilot called. Mashes nodded and rose to his feet, the others sensed Celeste following suit. Marcos remained behind Mashes, though the young Inquisitor could all but feel the man's gaze on his shoulders. "Do not falter now. The fate of the Imperium is a greater weight than the scorn of one Inquisitor. Nikolai, make sure that you and the others find somewhere to rest until I have presented Celeste to the High Lords." The Valhallan nodded as Mashes cast a glance back towards Marcos. "Anything you wish to add, Lord Inquisitor?" "I suppose it would be in our best interests for me to accompany you before the High Lords," Marcos replied, giving Mashes a thin smile. "After all, they may wish to hear my own testimony of the events that have transpired. The Sororitas will remain with your henchmen. Of course, more room for you to cast doubt among the minds of the Administratum, then?" Mashes refrained from speaking to the Lord Inquisitor further before turning to address Celeste herself. "Well, are you ready?" "Of course, Mashes." Celeste nodded, giving him the hint of a smile beneath her hood. "Lead on, please." With that, Mashes turned towards the ramp and started down, Celeste following right behind him while the Valhallans and Sororitas formed a ring around the entourage. The entrance leading to the Hall of the High Lords was just as Mashes had expected, a sweeping arch outlined with murals and carvings of past High Lords and great victories of the Imperium. Throngs of travelers and pilgrims milled about, ushered on by priests and lighter security details so they would not impede the paths of others. Finely dressed nobles and officers came and went, most going out of their way to avoid the common masses however they could. The air was thick with smog, conversation, and a host of smells Mashes did not wish to identify, yet the sweeping buildings above were more than enough to make one pause in awe. Most of his entourage certainly did, stopping for a moment as they craned their necks up to take in the design before them. Angelique mumbled something, swaying back and forth on her feet with her eyes fixated on Celeste, even as the older woman continued on unperturbed. Suppose I will have to investigate the effect the herald has on Angelique. Probably not dangerous, but I can't be too careful. Ahead, a smaller man stood before the main entrance to the Hall of the High Lords. Standing on either side of the entrance were two custodes, the gold-clad warriors staring out across the crowds. They barely seemed to notice as Mashes and company approached. I request access to the Senatorum chambers. And who might you be? The small man asked. Mashes Velis of the Ordo Xenos. Mashes gestured towards Celeste. I come bearing a woman who possesses information regarding the whereabouts of the Emperor. Oh, of course. The man turned slightly as a cherub drifted out of the shadows, the small servitor carrying a scroll in its arms. The man pulled a part of the scroll down, scanning it for a moment before turning back to Mashes. Yes, the High Lords have granted you an audience, though due to delays in proceeding I ask that you return in a week's time. I was told that our meeting would be today. Mashes replied, his left hand tightening slightly. I understand, sire, the man replied. But as the High Lords of Terra are the heart and soul of the Imperium, beneath the Emperor himself, it seems inappropriate that we should disregard their wishes. Mashes' jaw tightened. It would be like the bureaucrats to delay his mission further. I respect the authority of the High Lords, he said finally. But as a member of the Holy Ordos, my word is second to the Emperor. I am bringing forth vital information regarding his return, and by the authority vested upon me I order you to allow me and my entourage through to speak to the High Lords. The man hesitated, so Mashes glared at him. Would you care to delay the Ordos any further? Of course not, my lord. The man said, turning back to the cherub and scrawling down a message on the scroll. The cherub will conduct you to the High Lords. Thank you. May the Emperor's blessings follow you. With that Mashes pressed on, though in his rush to continue to the High Lords he failed to notice the custodes shift ever so slightly as Celeste glided past. A little brusque today, are we? Lord Marcos asked. We do the Emperor's work, Mashes said. And we must deal swiftly with all who would impede our progress. He looked back towards Celeste. Her body language had not changed in the slightest, but even from beneath her hood Mashes could tell she was glaring. Anger and frustration all but radiated off her, and Mashes found himself shivering slightly as he looked away. None of the terrors of the galaxy had ever caused Mashes to waver as he did around Celeste. What was it with that woman that would create such fear? They have forgotten my command. Celestia did not bother to look up as she and the others entered the main chambers of the High Lords. She ignored the splendor of mankind's achievements, even the giant statue of her fallen son Rogel Dorn did not catch her eye. They have forgotten my command. When she had first ascended, she had hoped the guidance of the Space Marines would help in rebuilding the Imperium following her departure. They knew her commands best, they would be listened to. But with the bureaucracy as oppressive as ever, Terra still a polluted hellhole, the Inquisition still turning on one another whenever the chance arose, and the Asteroids nowhere to be found, the situation was perfectly clear. They have forgotten my command. Inside, Celestia knew she could not be too harsh. The Imperium was still under attack from all sides, and the institutions of man were still needed. And it had been some time since her departure, it was not too far-fetched to see the system break down. But she was still human, she could still feel frustration towards her people. The trick was not allowing it to consume her further. Who comes now before the High Lords? A voice called as Celestia, Mashes, and Marcos continued on. She could feel Twilight and the others ushered away to seats, but put it out of mind for now. I am Inquisitor Mashes Velis of the Ordo Xenos, the younger man said. I stand before you with possible evidence to the location of the Emperor. There are squadrons of imperial vessels scouring the galaxy for the Emperor, another High Lord said. What makes you believe that you have found him? It is wild conjecture, lords. Celestia turned her head slightly as Marcos stepped forth. A witch under young Masha's care made the claim that the Emperor had placed a herald within territory controlled by the Vile Tau Empire. Upon arriving, we found this woman, he gestured towards Celestia. Who claimed to be the herald. As a loyal servant of the Ordo Hereticus, I have watched her these past months and have found no reason behind such claims. Would not the Emperor arrive in person, rather than sending a herald through the territory of our enemies? This woman knows much, my lords, Masha's offered. If she is who she says she is, it would be in defiance of the Emperor to turn her away. Even if she is not, she may hold some information to the true herald's location. Your concerns have been logged, the first High Lord said. Now then, will the woman please step forward and plead her case? The two inquisitors looked to Celestia, who gave them a small nod. As they moved behind her, Marcos leaned in slightly. Once you fail to convince the lords, he said. I look forward to torturing your true identity, witch. Speak further, and you will never again see the Emperor's light. Celestia growled. Killing Marcos would be impractical, even when she had revealed herself, but the threat would get him to back down for a little while. Who comes before the High Lords, bearing the shelter of the Holy Ordos? The first High Lord said. I am many things, Celestia said, raising her head slightly so she could look upon the lords without casting off her hood. Now, I take the role as a herald of dark times. I have watched the Imperium, seen how its enemies close in around it, tearing at its borders like wild dogs ripping a corpse. Xenos of all kinds slaughter our citizens with impunity. The dark powers of chaos may appear dormant but are on the rise, and sections of the Imperium remain in squalor. And where have you been, you great lords? When have you answered the cry of humanity? I beg your pardon, one lord asked. Who are you to judge our actions? Another said. We have all served the Imperium faithfully. No, you have not. Celestia cast her glance along the row of lords. Whether you realize it or not, you have all failed the Imperium in some way. All men fall victim to their grudges, their preferences, their base desires that cloud the seat of judgment. And in doing so, you have neglected the very thing that makes the Imperium strong, its people, its worlds. A murmur had rose through the crowds watching over the proceedings. Good, let them speak. You are trying our patience, woman, the First Lord growled. We act as the voice of the Imperium, not you. It is we who decide what is just, not you. And it is we who will decide your fate for belittling and defying this most sacred of institutions. But you will not, Celestia smirked, for you still wish to know the secret that I hold. The secret to the Emperor's return. Silence fell over the hall for a moment before Celestia continued. I can tell you that he is near, drawing closer to Terra with each passing hour. And you failed to tell the Ordos Xenos and Hereticus this, one of the High Lords said. Not by choice, mind you. Celestia replied. The Emperor entrusted me to lead him in, as one would lead a child down a road. You would compare the God Emperor to a child, the second High Lord cried. And by what authority do you claim this? The first said. Remove your hood and tell us all whose authority you truly serve. Silence reigned once again. Celestia's eyes darted from one lord to the next, taking in every line and emotion set on their faces. Well, if you insist. With a small smile, Celestia raised her hands and gripped the edge of her hood, pausing for just a moment to make sure that she had the High Lord's attention before dropping the illusion. The cloak dropped away, forming into a magnificent red cape that cascaded down golden armor. As if caught by wind, her hair spilled down over her shoulders, tucking around every crease and ridge in her armor. Sword and claw were revealed, gleaming as bright as they had when she had called the Great Crusade. The High Lords drew back in shock, the murmur of the call rising to crescendo as the illusion fell away. Look now, you Lords of Terra, she said, her voice carrying through the hall. I am the light of humanity, returned from the darkness of the warp. For thousands of years you have waited, watching the signs for me, but now you need not worry. Though my form is changed, my speech softer, know that I am your Emperor, and I have returned to restore the Imperium to its rightful place in the galaxy. The murmuring continued, dozens of spectators questioning themselves as they looked on. The High Lords took the news much better than Celestia had anticipated. Blasphemy! One shrieked. You would dare profane the Emperor's holy image with your cheap parlor tricks, asked another. You are a heretic, cried a third. A heretic and a traitor. What made you think that any of us would accept the Emperor returned as a woman? They continued to cry out objections and accusations, even as Celestia drew her head down and closed her eyes. I had thought you would not believe, she said. It takes more than common sight to do so. Now, open your souls, and behold my majesty. With that Celestia reached out a hand, a golden light enveloping it before all in the room froze. In that instance, they saw Celestia for who she was, her past among the ancient lands of Terra, her rise and fall at the dawn of the Imperium, her return to throw back the tides of chaos. Her entire life played out across their minds, details and events all collecting into an image of their ruler. She took care to sequester her memories of Equestria. There was no need to drag her ponies further into the Imperium. Celestia slowly lowered her hand, motion once again returning among the High Lords and the crowds. Now, do you see? She asked. There was another lengthy pause, all eyes fixated on the High Lords, who in turn started down at Celestia. Finally, one of the lords, the ecclesiarch, if she recalled correctly, stood up from his chair, gazing down at Celestia for a moment before speaking. I cannot deny what I saw, he said. Hail, for the Emperor has returned. Celestia closed her eyes again, listening as each Lord of Terra rose and proclaimed a similar message. The message spread quickly, all of those present rising to their feet to proclaim the message of the Emperor's return. Only Marcos remained silent, the man surveying the room for a moment before stalking towards the exit. His frustration was noted, but would be dealt with later. The anger of one man paled to the joy at the Emperor's return.